meditation and Eastern philosophy in India. He pioneered the introduction of human potential programs to business, and for 20 years worked with major corporations in various aspects of self-development. Peter has written 10 books, including The Awakening Earth, The White Hole in Time, and most recently, From Science to God, a physicist's journey into the mystery of consciousness. He produced the award-winning video, The Global Brain, and was concept consultant for the film Baraka. In 1993, the environmental magazine Buzzworm voted Peter Russell Eco-Philosophy Extraordinaire. It is a wonderful pleasure to introduce Peter Russell.
Thanks, Robin. These working okay? Okay. The mystery of consciousness. I want to actually rethink with you how we look at consciousness and the relationship of consciousness to matter, to the universe. This is that, whereas Irvin was talking about the big picture, this is coming down much more to the personal picture, but still looking at things from a completely different perspective, some of which ties in with what Irvin was saying earlier. And also re-looking at spirituality as well, which I see really as the exploration of consciousness, of human consciousness. So consciousness, the mystery of consciousness is, where does it come from? This is the mystery which science seems to be faced with, because there's nothing in any of modern science that predicts that any of us should ever have a conscious experience. We should all just be working like dumb biological robots, and it should all sort of go on in the dark. And yet science, the great thing about science, any theory should have a predictive quality. And yet the whole super theory that we have of modern science, the one thing it doesn't predict is that we're conscious. So there's a big problem there. And it's strange because it's the one thing we cannot deny. And I feel scientists are walking around with this strange situation. The one thing they cannot deny is they are experiencing beings, and the one thing they cannot explain is that they are experiencing beings. Another part of the paradox is, without consciousness there would be no science. All that we know, all of science, is actually models in consciousness. And yet science cannot model consciousness. So this is the question that's up at the most, been up for a number of years now, is basically the mind-brain problem in various forms. How does consciousness come out of the brain? How does it come out of matter? And we tend to assume that matter is unconscious, and so there's this problem of how, when a certain configuration of matter comes about, how does this magic thing happen and suddenly it lights up inside and there's subjective experience. This is often called the hard problem of consciousness. The hard problem being, or the hard question being, how does something as unconscious as matter ever lead to something as immaterial as consciousness? They're two totally different things. I don't think it's a hard question so much as a totally misguided question, founded on totally misguided assumptions about the nature of the universe, one of which is that matter is not conscious, as Irvin touched on earlier. It may well be that consciousness is in everything. But what I want to look at to start with is how, in some senses, everything is in consciousness. Everything's in the mind. It's all in the mind, which we heard a lot of people quoting that many times. We went around the 60s saying it's all in the mind. And it very literally is in some ways. When you're dreaming, we live in a reality when we're dreaming, which seems very real, and yet we wake up and we realize whatever it was we were dreaming, the sights we saw, the sounds, the music we heard, the conversations, the feelings we had, only existed in the mind. What is the difference when we actually open our eyes and look at the world? The brain is still generating its reality, but now instead of, whereas in dreams you're generating a reality in the mind out of memories and what's going on in the brain, now you've got direct data coming in through the eyes, and we know that what happens is that light comes in through the eyes, it sets off chains of electrochemical impulses which travel to the back of the brain, where the brain very cleverly, in about 1/10 of a second, analyzes it all, pieces it all together, and produces this image. And it's so good, the image, we think we're seeing the world. But right now, you think you're, experiencing the world directly. You think you're experiencing this debating chamber directly. What you're actually experiencing is the image that arises in the mind. And it's the same with the sounds you hear, the brain's decoding the sound vibrations, creating the quality of sound, the feeling of sitting in the seat. All of it is actually in consciousness. It's all an emerging within consciousness, continually arising in consciousness. And what arises in consciousness, we now realize, is nothing like the world out there. You see a color, you see blue. In the physical world, there's no blue light isn't blue. Blue light is just light of a certain frequency, a certain wavelength. It isn't actually blue, it's just a certain energy it has. The blueness is a quality which materializes in the brain, well, not in the brain, but in the mind. It's a quality which we experience in the mind. And it turns out that's true of almost everything. When you hear music, there's sound vibration there. The music you hear is actually an arising in consciousness. So, and it turns out almost everything we know, every thought, feeling, sense perception, hope, fantasy, image, all that goes on in our experience is a creation in consciousness. And it's very hard to get our minds around this, to realize that we think we're seeing the physical world, but what we're seeing are the forms that arise in the mind. And it turns out that the more we look into the physical world, we realize that what we think of as matter doesn't exist either. If you start looking at what is matter, this seems to be good, solid matter. You start looking down at it microscopically, you get down to the atomic level, and you soon realize that atoms are mostly empty space. In fact, if you blew an atom up so that the nucleus of an atom was the size of a golf ball, the electrons spinning round it would be like peas flying around a football stadium. So imagine a golf ball in the center of a football stadium and peas flying around it. How much empty space there is there? That's about the empty space there is in an atom. It's mostly empty space. And then you get down to quantum theory and you think, well, what are those? What is the neutron? What is the electron? They vanish. There's nothing there. There's just probabilities of you making certain observations. The German physicist Hans-Peter Dürr put it very nicely. He said, whatever matter is, it's not made of matter. Matter is another concept in the mind. It turns out, the reason we have this sense of solidness is because the electromagnetic forces in this don't let the electromagnetic forces in my hand pass through them, and so we have this experience of solidness. That's our experience. But all there is there's something there, but it's not a thing as we think of it. So this doesn't mean there isn't an external world. I'm not saying there isn't a world out there. I believe there's a world out there we are experiencing, but everything we know about it is actually in the mind. So when we ask, how does consciousness come out of matter? If you look at it, what we're really saying is, how does consciousness come out of the model of matter that we have in the mind, which is rather circular? We don't know what the physical world is really like. May turn out that it is just consciousness. One of the things I've been exploring recently, I've just been taking this idea there's no thing there in the world. It just all evaporates and disappears when you get down there. Supposing there is only consciousness and that electrons are just consciousness. Irvin was suggesting that maybe have their consciousness aspect and their physical aspect, but maybe they don't even have a physical aspect. Maybe it's just what we're observing in physics is just the interactions of tiny bits of consciousness. It turns out if you do that, all of physics still works perfectly well. Matter may just be a total illusion. It may just be consciousness interacting with itself throughout the cosmos. And all that Irvin was talking about earlier, that all holds up. If you just let go of the idea of there being any matter, what we're observing is the interaction of consciousness. But the point I want to come back to is that everything we're experiencing is a form in consciousness. The world literally informs consciousness. Consciousness takes on the forms that we experience. And that means consciousness, in a way, really does have infinite potential. It has the potential to become every single thing we ever experience, every scene you see, every sound you hear, every thought you have, every feeling. It's all consciousness taking on those forms. Every experience any other being anywhere in the universe could ever have or ever possibly have is part of the potential of consciousness. I remember when I was studying with Maharishi, he used to say consciousness is the field of all possibilities. I used to think he meant that somehow when you got in touch with that level of consciousness, you could do anything you want, the field of all possibilities. But now I realize probably what he was meaning was it's that every possible phenomenon in the universe is in consciousness in terms of our experience. And this, I think, is what the mystics have realized directly. And by the mystics, I mean the saints, the sages, the yogis, the rishis, the lamas, the roshis, the shamans, people in all different cultures who have gone and explored the mind, explored consciousness firsthand. And the word mystic comes from the Greek mist, meaning that which is hidden. It also means to have the eyes closed, that which cannot be seen. The mystic is somebody who doesn't explore the physical world, that is the world that can be seen, experienced. The mystic explores the inner world, the world of consciousness, the world of the mind. And that to me is the way to explore consciousness. I don't think you really get very far by sticking electrodes on the head. You can certainly find out a bit about what's happening in the brain. If you're going to explore consciousness, you need to get in there, inside your own mind, and start exploring it. It's a bit like, if you wanted to study, say, the Yanomami in the Brazilian rainforest, you could either get lots of photographs and artifacts that people had brought back and study it that way, or you could go out and live with them. I think going out and living with them, you probably get a much better study. In the same way, live with your own mind. That's what the mystics have done, is to explore the nature of mind. The Buddha once said, if you want to wake up, go and find yourself a quiet place and watch your mind. Then what the mystics have found by watching the mind is they begin to see this process of the emerging of form in the mind, the emerging of thought, the emerging of perception, of how that undifferentiated pure consciousness takes on form. And so you get lots of statements, things like Baba Muktananda saying, the whole universe, sun, moon and stars revolve within me. And you can find other statements by mystics about the whole universe being within them, which, from a normal materialistic point of view, doesn't make any sense whatsoever. I mean, I here am clearly inside the universe. What's he saying? The universe is within me. Doesn't make sense. Is this just a mind deranged by too much meditation? But if you think about it as the actual experience a person is having, everything they know, the whole universe as they know it, is a phenomena emerging in their mind as an experience. When you see it that way, it makes total sense. And what they are really saying is, when you get down to these deeper states of consciousness, the whole relationship of self and the world really turns inside out. We normally have the idea of the self. We have this feeling that I am here in the center of my world. Somewhere in the center of my head is usually the feeling. If you ask somebody where they are, they usually point to here in the middle of the head, or sometimes here in the heart. But it's usually somewhere here in the body, usually in the head. And we think, well, it makes sense that it's in the head because that's where the brain is. But I think it's nothing to do with where the brain is. It's just that is the center of our perception. It just happens that our eyes are on the head and our ears are around the head. I sometimes get people to do an imaginary experiment where you move your eyes down to the belly and you put your ears down to the belly. You imagine that happening, and then walking around the world, where would you feel yourself to be? You would probably be about 2 foot lower down in the world. I say an imaginary experiment. You can actually do the experiment now pretty well with virtual reality. It's actually a form of virtual reality called telepresence, where you connect up a virtual reality headset to videos and microphones which are somewhere else in another room. And you do that, and within about a minute of having all your experience coming from another room, within about a minute, you begin to feel yourself being in the other room. Your body's still here, but you begin to feel yourself there. So where we identify ourselves with is actually just the center of our focus of perception. But the whole of that experience is really happening inside you. And I think this is what the mystic experience is this feeling that the universe turns inside out. Instead of me being here and there's the whole world around, that sense of the observer disappears. There is just the experience. You're just there, there's just the experience. It is all just in consciousness. But this whole thing about the self is one of the primary roots into the mystical experience, this exploration of what is the self. You find it in many, many different traditions. It was Ramana's Maharshi meditation in India, who am I? It's written above the Delphic oracle in Greece, know thyself. You find it time and time again, this question, what is the self? What do we mean by the self? It seems so obvious. I mean, the word I, it's the simplest word, simplest stroke of the pen. In fact, I once wrote a sort of light-hearted piece entitled, Does God Speak English? Because I was fascinated by the fact that the word I, which is for many of us the most important word, is just one stroke of the pen, the simplest possible word, and happens also to be the same stroke of the pen as the number one, and the oneness and the self. I just thought, I don't know, perhaps. But what is the I? I mean, we know it so well, until you come to try to define what we actually mean by I. As soon as we start defining I, if you ask, who am I? The first things we do is think of the labels I have. I am Peter Russell, the things I do, my nationality, my character, all that stuff. But I could change any of those. That sense of I-ness would still be the same. I could even imagine myself being a different gender. Probably even today I could be. But that sense of I-ness would still be. The fact that I can imagine being a different gender, I may have different feelings, different outlook on the world, but that sense of I-ness would still be there. And we sometimes say, I'm not the same person I was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. An interesting statement, I am not the same person I was 10 years ago. Something's changed, but not that sense of I-ness. My personality may change, the character may change, all the things I value, that may change. I may have a total transformation of my whole outlook on the world. I may have a transformation. That sense of I-ness that has a transformation is still there. What is that sense of I-ness that's always there? That is the one thing we cannot seem to pin down, we can't define it. And yet we all know it so well. And we think it's this thing, we think there must be a self. We try to make this feeling of I-ness into a thing. And yet all the great mystics have said, time and time again, across history, different cultures, different spiritual traditions, when you really go into consciousness, when you really begin to explore it in deep meditation or through other ways, when the mind becomes quiet, what you discover is this sense of I-ness begins to dissolve. It isn't really there. It's an illusion, which we carry around. It's such a good illusion. We carry it around with us the whole time, but there's nothing really there. There is experience, and there's this sense of beingness, which the mystics say is really just is consciousness itself. It's just the feeling of being conscious. We all have that feeling of being conscious, which we try to make a thing out of it. We make it into something, and so we have this feeling of being, this amness, and it feels a unique feeling, and so we start dressing it up with all these different clothes, psychological clothes, in terms of our personality, our character, what we like, our history, what we've done, our ambitions and all that stuff. And we create this wonderful being with all these different qualities. We've dressed it up. But it's almost the opposite to the emperor having no clothes. This is the emperor that has lots of clothes but nothing underneath. And that's the one where we're often scared to actually let go to and discover that this sense of I-ness, which we all know so well, is just this sense of being, which means it's probably the same for each and every one of us. That sense of I-ness that I feel, that sense of beingness, is probably what each and every one of you, and probably each and every self-conscious entity in the cosmos feels. It's just that feeling of consciousness, of beingness. We probably are all exactly the same at that fundamental level. That's why I think it's often called the universal self. Not that it's one self in everything, but it's the same quality of self, the same universal experience. But what happens when we dress it up in all these little personality things, our sense of who we are becomes very dependent upon the world, upon what we're doing, upon how other people see us and all that stuff. And as soon as the world changes or someone criticizes us or something we're attached to changes or disappears, we feel threatened. That sense of beingness is never threatened, never. But all this, the stuff we build around it is easily threatened. And so we get into lots of behaviors designed to maintain or reinforce or bolster that, usually at somebody else's expense. And this leads to a lot of the crazy behaviors in the world. I was just thinking, actually, I was coming here, supposing, the leaders of the world who we think about so much at the moment these days, supposing they didn't have that sense of, that need to keep a sense of who they were and their ego intact. How much of what happens in the world comes from that individual need to be seen, to be consistent, whatever it was, to be somebody, to even be a leader. Plato said it perfectly. Plato said, anybody who wants to be a leader should immediately be banned. The very act of wanting to be a leader should be the one thing that cuts you out. But the other thing that happens that gets in our way is not only because we get into this creation of the world and we get so attached to the material world out there, we get into this belief system which is sort of hypnotized into us really from the day we're born by everything that happens in our culture that says whether or not you're happy, whether or not you're at peace, whether or not you feel okay inside, depends upon what's going on around you. It depends upon your situation. So if you're not feeling happy, if you're not feeling at peace, if you're not feeling okay, do something about it. Change something in the world. Go and buy yourself something, a new jacket or something, or whatever it is, or do something. Change the situation, which works if the reason you're not happy is there's something actually wrong with the world. If it's cold, you need to do something to warm up. If you're hungry, you need to eat. But most of the time in our culture that we feel down or low, we don't feel happy, is not because we're lacking something physical. It's because we're lacking something inside. There's some inner need or something that's not being taken care of. But our whole culture gears us towards going out there and do something about it. That's why I think we consume so much more than we need in our culture. We're consuming in the belief that if only we just consumed enough, we'd finally find happiness, peace of mind. That's why I think we love money. I mean, money itself isn't very lovable. But our attitude towards money is we believe the more we have of this nebulous stuff, the more we can control the world, buy the things that will make us happy, the experiences, even the friends or relationships we want. It's a tool to get these things. And this is why I think there's so much greed in the world. We're caught in this belief that things make us happy. And what we're really trying to do is use the external world to actually nourish and feed the internal world, and it doesn't work. There's that lovely Nasruddin story, some of you probably know. It's one of the most famous Nasruddin stories. Nasruddin is the Sufi wise fool. He appears foolish, but there's wisdom in his foolishness. And in this story, Nasruddin is found outside his house one night, under a street lamp, on his hands and knees, looking for something in the gravel. And his neighbor comes along and says, "Oh, have you lost something? Can I help you?" And Nasruddin says, "Yes, I've lost the key to my house." And so the neighbor says, "Oh, let me help you find it." And he gets down on the ground and they're groveling around, and after about 10 minutes they still haven't found the key. And he says, "Where exactly did you drop it?" And he said, "Oh, somewhere in my house." So he says, "Well, excuse me, but what are you doing looking for it out here?" And he says, "Well, there's more light out here." There's more light out here. But what do we do in life? I mean, what we're looking for, ultimately, everything we do, if you analyze it, if you really look into it, everything we do, we're doing in one way or another because we hope we'll feel better, more content, more at peace by doing it, more at ease. We don't do it because we expect to suffer, except in the short term. I'll go to the dentist to suffer for half an hour because I believe that I will feel better in 5 years' time. Ultimately, everything we do is about how do we feel inside. And we look outside to find it. Because there's more light out there, we know how to manipulate and form and create wonderful pleasures in the external world. The inner world, it's dark in there. We don't in our culture really understand how to work with the mind, and so we work with this stuff, thinking if we can just get this stuff right, get the material form right, we'll all be happy. But it doesn't work. It's for several reasons. First thing, they've done studies since about 1957. Studies have been done charting how happy, how content people are. And back in 1957, about 30% of the population was happy with what they had in life. And today, 40 years later, 50 years later, the number of people who are happy with what they have in life is about 30%. Nothing's changed. Everything's changed. In the number of television channels, the number of fruits you can buy in a supermarket, the number of cars per household, all these things that should make us happier. We've got lots of them, but we're actually not any happier. The project's failed. If it was any other project, that would have been going on for 50 years and had produced 0 results, the project would be axed completely. But this project to make ourselves happy by just having better new models of car and refrigerator and whatever it is, bits of software and credit cards, hasn't actually worked. And the reason it doesn't work is because ultimately it's not things that make us happy. We think it is. I was speaking at a conference in Ireland recently, and the speaker before me was this lady politician, I'll leave it at that, who stood up and said, she was talking about shopping and shopping malls and the development of shopping malls and how important it was that people could go shopping because buying things made people happier. If you actually look at what's happening in our culture, the advertising, the marketing, all that stuff actually makes us unhappier. If you look at the background message to any advertisement, the background message is, you can't be feeling okay, there's something missing in your life, you will feel better when you get it, whatever it is. What actually happens is we make ourselves discontent because we think we're missing something. This is what the Buddha realized 2,500 years ago in his Four Noble Truths. The second noble truth, the truth of clinging, is basically that we create what he called dukkha, which is often translated as suffering, but it doesn't really mean suffering. People, when they think about Buddhism, they think, oh, Buddhism, everybody suffers. What he was actually saying was the first noble truth, we all experience what he called dukkha. Dukkha is actually a negative. In the Pali language, it's the negative of sukha. And sukha means ease, to be at ease. Dukkha is not being at ease, feeling discomfort. We all have periods of feeling discomfort, and what he saw was the mind in its natural state is at ease. We create dis-ease, we create discomfort in the mind because we want things to be different. So our culture keeps on creating dis-ease, discomfort. We go and buy something and temporarily we feel better because we've stopped wanting that thing. And then we find something else we're missing. And so we make ourselves feel not at ease again. And what we don't realize, we think it's the buying something that makes us happy. What we don't see is it's the wanting it that makes us unhappy. The buying it just gives us an excuse to stop wanting for a while. This is what's driving the world crazy. It doesn't work. Not only does it not work on the individual level, it's not working for the planet either. It's just causing us just to take more and more and more, and with consequences that we're seeing all around us. So the other thing it does is it completely screws us up, basically. If we're caught in this belief that whether or not we have the right things, the right situations is what's going to make us happy, our minds get caught into future thinking. We start worrying about how things are going to be in 5 minutes' time or 5 days' time, what's going to happen to, things at home, my work, the stock market, whatever it is, or little things. Am I going to forget what I'm going to say? Whatever it is. Fears come up. The mind gets caught in all this worry and anxiety about how things are going to be, how they're not going to be. And by definition, a mind that is worried, a mind that's anxious, can't be a mind that's at peace. And I think this is sometimes the sad joke about human beings. We're so busy worrying all day long about whether we're going to be at peace tomorrow, we never actually take the opportunity to be at peace in the present moment. We keep ourselves in this state of anxiety, slight tension. I'm sure some of you know the work of Eckhart Tolle, The Power of Now. I mean, he saw this very clearly, how as soon as we start thinking, what he saw was as soon as we start thinking, we lose contact with the present moment. We get caught up in the dialogue, the thought that's going on. We're no longer fully experiencing what's happening in the present moment. What also happens is as soon as you start thinking, a little tiny bit of tension comes into the mind. And those of you who've done a lot of meditation or been on sort of long silent retreats have probably noticed this. When the mind becomes really quiet and the thinking stops, you realize there's that element of, there's a slight tightness which has gone. As soon as you start thinking, this sense of tightness comes back into the mind. It's like things begin to crystallize and take form again. This sense of background tension comes in. So I think this worrying about how things are just keeps us in this very slight state of tension. It stops us really being at ease and stops us being fully aware of what's happening, fully aware of the present. Stops us being awake. In fact, one of the most useful ways to think about higher states of consciousness is more in terms of waking than, we talk, things like enlightenment, etc. I find, I don't know, I don't like the term. It implies it's something out there we're going to achieve or get, as opposed to waking up, which is something we can do any moment. And that's what I like about Eckhart Tolle's work. He just, we can wake up any moment. And we go to sleep again pretty quickly, but then you can wake up again. You've probably heard the phrase, we're already enlightened, but we just don't know it, which I find pretty useless, personally speaking. I mean, who knows if it's true or not? It doesn't actually mean anything to say I'm already enlightened, but I don't know it. But if you think about it in terms of waking up, it makes a lot more sense. We are already awake. Each and every one of us is awake. We're conscious. We're just not awake to it. We're not awake to our own wakefulness. And I think that's what happens when we start coming back to just being in the present. We start becoming awake to the fact we are awake. I sort of think of it as lucid waking. Lucid dreaming is you're dreaming, and normally we're caught up in the dream. You don't realize you're dreaming, but then you can have those lucid dreams where you wake up in the dream and you realize, oh, I'm just dreaming, and you can watch the dream somehow. I think it's the same thing with waking up to the present. We move into a state which I call lucid waking. It's like, I'm here, this is going on, and there's just this awareness that's there. And this is, I think, what we are moving towards collectively. I think all the various mystics in many different cultures have been foretastes of where humanity is headed. They're like, when water starts boiling, when you bring water to a boil, you get those little bubbles that start coming off in advance. I think the great saints and yogis have been like bubbles coming off in advance of people who have woken up to the true nature of consciousness. You could say they are the prophets. This is the prophets' conference. They are the prophets of what is coming. But whereas they've been one in 10,000 or one in 100,000 before, who knows, very few. They are now, I think, we're coming to the stage where this is happening more and more, and will be happening more and more. And I think for several reasons. I think firstly, we need that sort of awakening like never before. As I said, the old way is no longer working. We're not actually getting any better for it. But also, because of the way we are abusing, destroying our habitat, we are in a real crisis. And that crisis is essentially a spiritual crisis. It's a crisis of consciousness. It's a crisis of how we look at the world, how we value things. Everything that goes wrong in the world, or our failure to redeem what goes wrong, repair it, all of that is coming out of human thinking, human values, basically out of human self-centered, materialistic thinking. And at the same time, we have a culture which is basically spiritually arid. When we call ourselves a sort of Christian culture or whatever, we look at the way our governments respond, etc. It's not really a spiritual culture. So the need is there, and this is why I think more and more people throughout the world are turning to spirituality in one way or another. It's becoming this grassroots movement, which wasn't there 30, 40 years ago. And also the ability to connect with that is there like it never was before. The need is there and the ways to do it. And when I first started getting interest in this area, which was about, back in the 60s, I'd go into my local bookstore in Cambridge and there was about one shelf devoted to sort of alternative spiritual stuff. There was, translations of the Bible and that stuff, and then up there you could see Paul Brunton and those people, little tiny shelf for them. Now you go into, I don't know how many bookstores there are in Oxford even just devoted to consciousness, that sort of work. It's available, we're learning. And it's not just books, whether it's tapes, videos, the internet. It's available, but also what is available is not just our own culture. What is available to us to learn from are all the spiritual cultures of the world. 200 years ago, you'd have probably been limited to what was available in your particular, in this culture, Christian culture. Now we can draw upon Taoism or Buddhism or shamans from South America or Siberia or whatever. We have the world's global spiritual wisdom available to us. And this has never happened before. And the other thing that's happening with it is this what I call the fine-tuning that's going on. We are all learning from each other, learning collectively from each other. And I think we are getting closer and closer to really discovering what this waking up is about. I mean, I come to a conference like this and I'm learning from people here, from other speakers, from people I talk to. You may be learning something from me. We're learning from each other. And as we do that, the funny thing that's happening is we're all beginning to sound the same. In fact, a few years ago, somebody came up to me after a talk and said, "What is it you're saying that's different from what everybody else is saying?" And my response was, "Nothing, I hope." Because if I'm saying something fundamentally different, then that's clearly where I've got it wrong. So probably, Prophets Conference in 5 years' time, we won't need, a dozen speakers, just one will do because the others will all be the same. Just take note, Cody. But whenever you have this, whenever you have a situation where people are learning from others, where the system is reinforcing itself, you get positive feedback, which means the change starts happening faster and faster. And I think that's happening with this awakening. It's speeding up because of this positive feedback. I just find, talking to people, the number of people who feel more has happened to them in the last 3 or 4 years in this area than maybe happened in the 10 years previously. We're moving ahead faster. And what I'm always fascinated by is the generational thing that's happening. I look at some of the next generation, the generation behind me, ahead of me, whatever, younger. People, typically, the people I meet who are generally the kids of friends of mine. And I see incredible wisdom there, incredible wisdom that didn't exist when I was that age. And when I was that age, we used to think we were pretty hip and cool and things, and by the standards of the time we probably were. But I think if you take some of people in their teens, 20s today, if you could put them in a time machine and send them back to the 60s, people there wouldn't know what had hit them. I think there's more wisdom in some individuals there today than there ever was back then. That to me is just a sign of how much our culture is changing. And the point about this is we're changing collectively. It's our whole culture that's waking up. I mean, because I've been at this, working on the spiritual stuff, exploring it myself for most of my adult life, doesn't mean to say I'm, 30 years wiser, 40 years wiser than other people. We're all 40 years wiser. Our culture is 40 years wiser. So that's why I see a lot of the younger people they're just as wise as I am. It's not that you have to live so many years, it's our culture is wising up collectively. And this is part of the whole accelerating pattern we're in. The whole world is accelerating. We see this in terms of the pace of life, scientific advance, technological advance, the rate at which you have to keep on upgrading your software or take on new technologies. Everything's moving faster and faster and faster. The number of emails you get each day, the things you have to do, it's all speeding up. We're on this accelerating curve. And tragically, so is the devastation of the environment. It's on a similar accelerating curve. You look at the rising CO2 levels, they're a perfect accelerating curve, matching the acceleration in our energy consumption. And I believe there's this third accelerating curve, which is the collective waking up of humanity, collectively moving towards the states of consciousness which the great sages, prophets have been touching for thousands of years, moving collectively towards that. And that leads to the whole idea of maybe we're heading towards something which is almost completely unimaginable. I don't know where this is going, but I think we're going to end up with 10, 20 years' time, technologies that are literally beyond our imagination now. Think back in our own lifetimes, go back 10 years. Most of us 10 years ago were just beginning to hear about things like the internet, email. Look how much has happened in our own lives in 10 years. Given that things are moving faster, accelerating, where are we going to be in another 10 years, let alone another 20? Impossible to imagine. We're going to have technologies which will seem like magic to us today. We will be in a world that will be much more severely in crisis than it is today. I say that because we've done very little to actually change things. Things are getting worse, continue to get worse. And perhaps with people en masse who are much wiser, more awake, more compassionate than they've ever been before. How those three elements play out, I've no idea. But I think we're heading rapidly into the most exciting, challenging, fascinating times ever. And people look at the accelerating trends. If you look just 20 years ahead to about 2025, we reach what's called the technological singularity. The singularity in mathematics is where the curve goes infinitely steep. It doesn't go on getting faster and faster, it goes up vertical. Well, just before it goes vertical, there's what's called the technological singularity, which is basically when you start getting your average PC, your average 600-pound PC that you have on your desk, will have the same computing power as your own mind. And when that happens, it becomes more efficient to get computers to design computers than get human beings to design computers. And the whole curve just takes off. And there's many, many different scenarios of what can happen. But we're just talking 20 years, that's likely. 20 years is just half the time since the 60s in the future. And then there's what's called the developmental singularity, when the curve itself a bit later goes vertical, which no one has any idea what that's about, but it's somewhere out there. That's what I called the white hole in time, because there's parallels with a black hole in space in terms of its development. A black hole in space, which Irvin touched upon, is the end of the evolution of a large star. And the interesting thing is that as a star approaches that endpoint, it goes faster and faster and faster and faster. It takes billions of years to burn hydrogen. And then it goes through a helium burning phase, which happens much faster, and then through a neon burning phase and a silicon burning phase. And these get faster and faster and faster till the final stages take about 15 minutes and the star collapses. And then there's this supernova explosion. And it strikes me that if we look at the evolution of consciousness, maybe the same thing's happening. It's getting faster and faster and faster, along with everything else getting faster and faster to this point, where maybe collectively we wake up to the true nature of consciousness and realizing it is all in consciousness, it is all consciousness in the first place. Maybe that's the realization we have collectively, maybe that's where we're headed as a species, towards that complete awakening to the true nature of consciousness. It would be like a collective near-death experience multiplied 1 billion times, probably, or 6 billion times. But again, Irvin mentioned the near-death experience. The thing that fascinates me about the near-death experience, apart from the fact that now we've got a number of cases where we really know people were technically dead when they had the experiences. There's people in hospitals where they can tell they were actually, by all accounts, dead. It wasn't just something that happens, as some people believe, oh, it's just the brain when it's dying goes through this phase and you get all these lights. These experiences are actually happening when people are technically dead. It seems that is the state, that is consciousness, when we let go of any sense of individuality. We let go of all that individuality, that fear, that concern, all that stuff, the thinking, all the stuff that normally constrains us, and our attachment to the senses. We become free from that. And there's that experience which general qualities are of just light. Everything is light. It's complete peace, and just surrounded by that sense of love. In fact, in Indian thought, death is sometimes called Maha Samadhi, the great Samadhi. Maybe this point which lies ahead of us, I kind of think maybe it's the Maha Samadhi, or the Mega Maha Samadhi, if you want to mix languages. But I think it lies ahead potentially. I don't want to belittle the extreme danger we are in. And if we keep on going as we are, then that potential probably will never realize. We'll probably screw up the whole thing long before then. And civilization will, who knows, there's many different scenarios. And if I look at the state of the world, myself, what's going on, the failure to really tackle the problems, I can get very, very despondent. And I sometimes console myself with thinking, well, there's still the opportunity for individual awakening while the whole thing falls to bits completely. I mean, it's hard when you really look at all the different things, all the different problems, whether environmental problems, social, economic, to really see us making it through. It just seems such an impossible problem, sometimes called the problematique, the sort of the whole collection of problems that we've created for ourselves. And then I think the other side of that is to remember that awakening can happen also in a flash. A change of heart can just happen. St. Paul on the road to Damascus type experiences. People here might have even had them. And they seem to happen when, who knows quite why, but for some reason or other that person is ripe. Something happens, it could be a very small trigger, maybe nothing even identifiable. Something happens, and out of that ripeness of the consciousness, some shift happens to that individual. They let go of a whole framework, mindset through which they've been seeing the world, which have been holding them back from knowing their true nature. Something happens, there's a breaking open, a letting go, and an individual's sudden transformation, waking up. And could that happen on a collective level? I don't know. But it seems possible. There seems to be this, there's a ripening, I think. We are collectively realizing the old ways don't work. There's this growing exploration, this grassroots exploration of the inner in many, many different ways. Could we be ripening? And then something, who knows what, some trigger, series of triggers. It could be anything. I can fantasize about a lot of different things it could be. All I want to say is I have no idea what's going to happen. No idea. And when I remember that, all that despondency, I can say, yes, things are really serious, and I've no idea. So all I can do is keep working on the ripening in myself, in others. And it's fun. I think the one thing we often tend to overlook in all of this is like, as if, this inner waking up should be, something we do, like it's, going to the gym or something, which most people don't really enjoy, but they do it as a duty. Some people enjoy it. I don't. What we forget about the process of waking up is each little step you take, the freer you feel, the better you feel. And so it's its own self-reinforcing process. So let me just finish with some lines which many of you probably already know, because I've said them before and other people have said them. I think Gene Houston used to say them a lot, and I'm trying to think, what's his name? Anyway, Sir George, Sir George, good old Sir George, bless him. A wonderful catalyst in this country. The lines from Christopher Fry's play, A Sleep of Prisoners, which was actually written during the Second World War, but they're lines which I think are even more relevant today. The human heart can go the length of God. Dark and cold we may be, but this is no winter now. The frozen misery of centuries cracks, breaks, begins to move. The thunder is the thunder of the flows, the thaw, the flood, the upstart spring. Thank God our time is now, when wrong comes up to meet us everywhere, never to leave us till we take the greatest stride of soul folk ever took. Affairs are now soul size. The enterprise is exploration into God. But where are you making for? It takes so many thousand years to wake. But will you wake? for pity's sake. Thank you. Thanks, and we have some time for questions, comments, discussion, dialogue, and Cody has a microphone.
Test.
Which is working.
Thank you, Peter. I very much agree with what you were saying. I think a lot of it depends on...
Sir, I can't hear you. Maybe take much...
I'm sorry, I'll shout. I think a lot of it depends on maybe giving up our feelings of being individuals, thinking of ourselves. I think this idea of maybe consciousness, maybe building a consciousness between us would be something. I know myself, I took my money out of from Barclays Bank and put it in Triados. I don't know if you've heard of them, but they particularly talk about doing decent things with the money. Building, they don't send me much interest, but they send me letters telling me what the kind of ecological projects they've been supporting. And I go and talk about this with friends, and they tell me, no, I just go for money for myself, and I'm very, very disappointed in this. I think it's all part of the same phenomenon, that people have to give up being individuals and work for society together. Meetings like this are maybe something positive for the future. Waking up is something fine when it happens and another click and spreads.
Sorry?
I say waking up is fun to do, creating something very different. I think we're maybe on the verge of this happening. We're in a race against time, I feel, looking around and looking at our planet and the way things are going on it, and the way we're getting more like Venus, which has a carbon-rich atmosphere and a surface temperature of 400 degrees and is uninhabited. And it might not always have been.
Okay, did I hear you? Did you have a question or just commenting?
Who's next here?
Yes. Well, hello. Thanks for the talk. I just would like to put the thing a bit the other way around, and perhaps I could articulate, perhaps it's more of a reflection than a question, but also a question. I would like to see what's your take on that. And we could call the blackmail of mysticism, right? I mean, the blackmail, right? Yeah, I'll try to, expound a bit on that, right? I agree, on that there is the crisis we are facing is a crisis of paradigm. It's because of our level of consciousness, and I agree that happiness is inside, and so on, what you have said, right? But we've got an embodied reality, that there is something going on out there, like, for instance, if you are in a job which you don't like, women, we know it very well, that we are supposed to take care of many things. Well, men can, go and think about the mystery of consciousness or whatever, right? And so it's like, no, but that's quite the case, right? So, and it's so what is what I want to say? Yeah, it's when you have a problem now in the present and in the West because of this kind of new age, in which I agree, then they say, well, go mystical, go into your inside. But what about, you have the problems there at work, and how do you put the two things together? I know it's a very difficult question because it's also this divide in Western philosophy between, idealism and materialism, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Okay?
Okay. It's a very common question. And it's not, I don't think it's so difficult. I think it's a very real question. If we have, there are very real issues, not just at work, in the world that that need sorting out. But if we can isolate this aspect I'm talking about is the way in which we make our own well-being a victim of what is happening out there. And we say, I cannot feel happy unless I have something or whatever it is, unless I get this situation sorted out. That, I think, is the tragedy. That's what we don't need to do. And if we can reconnect with ourselves, I think we're in a better state of mind in which to sort out what it is that needs sorting out at work or wherever it is. And I think in principle, I say in principle because it's hard to do it, in principle I think we always have a choice over how we feel or how we experience something. An example I used to use a lot when I was working with business people, still do a bit, is what happens when we're stuck in a traffic jam, because most of them could relate to it. Most people think the traffic jam makes you stressed. I point out it isn't that at all. It's the internal dialogue, the voice in the head, the inner commentary that's telling you all the bad things that can happen. You feel upset. Someone else could be in exactly the same situation saying, this is wonderful. I've got no emails to answer, whatever. I can sit back, I can relax. The point is you've got exactly the same external situation, two different ways of looking at it. And I think this is a core idea that comes up in just about every single spiritual tradition, that our perception of the world, we don't need to be a victim of circumstances in terms of how we perceive and how we feel about things. So we actually have a choice over how we see things and how we feel. And I think if we exercise that choice, we're then in a better situation to deal with whatever the external circumstances are asking of us. Doesn't mean to say we have to be wonderfully happy and accept everything, but we don't need to get ourselves screwed up unnecessarily. We can be more at peace with things, be more in the present. Okay, are there any other questions? Yeah, we've got.
As a psychologist, I'm interested in what is happening when people disassociate from very painful situations that they're in. What is happening there when people spontaneously disassociate? There is no choice in that situation.
I'm not enough of a psychologist, that sort of psychologist, to really know or answer that. I mean, I know the phenomena. I sometimes notice it in myself happening. Looking at myself when I see that happening, I see there's a fear there. There's a fear of something I may not be able to handle if I let it in, and I can sometimes feel that sort of blocking something off. So I think it probably comes down to some fear or other, but I don't know much more than that. I haven't studied it enough, apart from just being intrigued by watching it when it happens to me. Yeah.
Peter, your answer a couple of questions ago about the different things that we can do in the same situation. My question is, the world at large is such a distraction. And what I'm wondering is, have you given any thought, or do you know who has given any thought, to what could be some external catalyst that could help us move on?
Well, someone I know who works in a think tank in Washington who's explored just about all possibilities thinks it has to be ETs arriving on the White House lawn. He's serious. Not necessarily the White House lawn, but But who knows, some form of real contact. I mean, I'm sure there's other intelligence out there that may be more advanced than us in some way, and it may not be coming along in tin cans, but the catalyst, I mean, leaving aside things outside this earth, I think the media, I think it will come, the catalyst will come through the media in one way or another, because that is the global information machine, the reach. And I sometimes just muse myself, supposing, you know, somebody with the charisma of the Dalai Lama, with that sort of, but also somebody who really had that power of communication, which some people have, to really just say the truth, and you listen to them and you go, shit, yes. They've got, you know, that. Supposing, you know, they were on Newsnight and Mr. Paxman changed his attitude a bit towards them. Who knows? Who knows? I mean, I think something like that. I think the media, something in the media. I mean, I could fantasize about the details, but that would be my prime candidate. Is somebody with that ability to actually directly be and communicate in a way that has that power to wake people up, doing that collectively through the media, probably television. Or the internet, because the internet and television are merging rapidly.
Could it be something negative?
Could be.
Really shocked. It doesn't always have to be something positive.
Could be some, yeah, the question is, could it be something negative? Could be many things, but there's this sad thing about human nature is we keep on riding through one negative thing until it gets almost too late. I mean, I've seen, you know, people who their doctors have told them, you know, if you continue like this, you're going to make yourself sick, and they continue like it until they do finally make themselves sick. And then maybe it's, you know, too late to, well, not too late, but they start turning then. So it could be something negative, wakes us up, but it would need to be something negative that would help us actually see that we need to change. So often when something goes wrong, we blame it out there. I mean, the whole thing with terrorism is a perfect example of that, the way most people have handled that. There's a problem out there rather than there's a problem here. And most natural disasters, quote, natural disasters and things, people don't see the direct connection between their thinking and their action and their way of being and what's going wrong. So it would need to be something that would, of such a nature, that we saw clearly that it was demanding that we change as individuals. Who knows? Who knows? Anything can happen. Revolutionize education. Yes. I think so. Yeah. Do it. Revolutionize education. Great. But I mean, before we start saying all the things that should happen, remember there's lots of people saying all the things that should happen, and my point is we have to do them. Yeah. Where's the mic? We've got another couple of minutes.
Thank you, Peter. Could there be, do you think, a phased transition of consciousness? In other words, a spontaneous change, you know, the 100 monkey syndrome? And if there was, what would it look like?
I think that's what I was sort of partly pointing towards. The 100th monkey thing has been somewhat... Yeah, Lyle was guilty. Lyle Watson was the person who really brought into the limelight. Guilty of a little over-interpretation there. Maybe this is something you should ask Rupert more after the next talk. That's more his field. But yes, it could well be. It could well be. Something could happen where there's something happening on a collective level below the surface, which we're all in some way or other resonating with. That could lead to something happening. Anything like that, it could be possible. Yeah. I I'm saying that anything like that is possible, but what it comes back to is each of us has a responsibility to continue, I think, doing that inner work of awakening. It's when we're talking about, waking up collectively, it's about each of us also waking up and doing that. And then that is maybe what will encourage, facilitate some phase transition or whatever. I don't think it will happen on its own. You need to heat the water for it to start bubbling. Just take one more.
Isn't that actually happening now? Well, sorry, I hate microphones.
I can't hear you if you sort of talk to me with the mic.
Isn't that actually happening now, though? We've got the negative things. We're here. We are on the process of waking up.
Yeah.
We're
Yeah.
actually sitting in a room together,
Yeah.
doing that.
Yeah.
And that we start with ourselves now, and that we are like I don't know what the saying is, but we do it. Starts at the home, doesn't it? So.
Yeah. It's all part of the process.
We
yeah.
keep saying could be's. That's why I was
Okay.
a bit concerned.
Yeah, we are, and we have been, and we will be. Yeah, thanks. Okay, it's time. So it's finished there. But I'm going to be around for most of the weekend, so we can hang out and chat. Thank you.